I'm Matthew, this is Lemora's Cards, and welcome to Learn to Play, my series where I have experienced members of the cEDH community come on to teach you about one of their decks. If you enjoyed this video, consider liking, commenting, subscribing, or supporting me over on Patreon like these amazing patrons did, including $10 patron Neo Venus. You can also check out my stream over on twitch.tv/Lemora's Cards. You're seeing this day of release. I'll be streaming tonight, Saturday, 6 p.m. EST, and I'll be streaming every week at that same time, so come on over, check it out. You can see decks like these, ask questions, talk to my guests, and just have a great time. And with that, I'll pass it over to this week's guest.
Hello everyone, my name is Eisenherz. Very happy to be here. You might know me from Moxfield or Discord. I am a cEDH player and brewer. In real life, I'm a teacher, but in cEDH community, I write primers. I'm an L1 judge. I'm also a reviewer for the cEDH decklist database. And in my free time, I create YouTube videos about cEDH. Today we're going to talk about Urza Power Scepter, which is one of the variants of Urza in cEDH. This deck is an adaptive midrange deck that utilizes very strong stacks pieces such as Winter Orb, Static Orb, and Trinisphere to slow down the game, and then it wins by creating infinite mana, which it can dump into Urza to perform infinite mana and infinite card loops, or it can just win in a pinch with Beatdown by creating a lot of construct tokens. Urza Power Scepter, as I said, is an adaptive mid-range deck, but it's also a combo deck, and it's very strongly based on artifacts. So what you want to do is you want to ramp into Urza very early, so you have him at play, most optimally in turn 1, but definitely viable to have him in turn 2, turn 3. So after you've put Urza into play, you want to slow down the game. You can do that by putting stacks pieces into play. We have cards like Winter Orb, Static Orb, and Trinisphere, which you can shut off with Urza by tapping them. But we also have very strong hate pieces like Back to Basics, which helps against multicolored decks. We also play Karn the Creator, which helps against treasure loops and other strong artifacts. Another interesting card would be Grafdigger's Cage, which really helps against the Underworld Breach strategies. And if you play against a Thrasios player, for example, you can tutor your Pithing Needle and turn off that Thrasios. So a lot of different hate pieces in order to slow down the game and bring it down to our pace, like the mono blue pace, not the turbo pace. Once you've made infinite mana, you will be able to perform either a Twister Loop or an Scepter Loop. First of all, you need infinite mana, you need infinite card draw, which we don't have, but we use Urza's activated ability instead, which is basically the same at that point. You need access to Time Twister, you need access to Narset's Reversal, and then you need access to any spell that will go to the graveyard. Something like Aether Spellbomb, for example. Play that spell, and it goes to your graveyard. Then you cast Time Twister, hold priority, and cast Narset's Reversal, targeting your Time Twister. You'll create a copy of Time Twister on the stack, and the original Time Twister will be put back into your hand. Now, the copy resolves. Your spell, the one you cast initially, will be shuffled back into your library, as well as Narset's Reversal and the Time Twister that's in your hand. Now, all the 3 cards you just used are back in your library. You can now reactivate Urza to regain access to those cards and do it all over again. You can do that with anything from a bounce spell or a pseudo outlet like Winds of Rebuke, which will allow you to mill everyone out. You can then just pass the turn and your opponents will deck themselves. And sometimes you don't have access to those cards because they got exiled, in which case we can pivot to another kind of loop, for example the dual scepter loop. We need for that is we need Isochron Scepter in play with Dramatic Reversal imprinted onto it, and then we need a copy of Isochron Scepter, which we can make with Phyrexian Metamorph, and we will imprint Narset's Reversal onto that. We can now play a spell, and while it's on the stack we will activate the second Isochron Scepter, and cast Narset's Reversal and put the original spell back into our hand and create a copy on the stack. While that's still on the stack, we can activate Dramatic Reversal from the first Isochron Scepter to untap both Isochron Scepters, and then we can let the spells resolve and redo it all over again. That's a classic Scepter Loop. You can use that, for example, with Swan Song to create infinite swans. Like I mentioned before, this is an adaptive mid-range deck that uses a lot of stacks pieces. It's not a dedicated stacks in the sense of a rule of law deck, and it's not a mid-range deck like Thrasios would be. We can't play the game like any of those decks would. What we want to do is we want to play a kind of control style, which is not that common in cEDH because controlling 3 players is not as easy as controlling 1 opponent. So we want to put stacks pieces into play that slow down the game, but we can't play it like the typical rule of law deck would that could just create a absolutely hard lock where nobody has any chance to combo off in any way. However, we can control the board in a way that denies resources and puts strategically chosen stacks pieces into play to combat the meta, like Artifact Hate, like Karn the Creator to stop those Dockside loops, or Grafdigger's Cage to stop Underworld Breach lines. We can't play Turbo, but we need to deal with Turbo, so we play a lot of early interaction. We can't play as grindy as Thrasios would, so we have cards like Pithing Needle, and we kind of want to win in the later part of the game, so turn 6, 7, 8 forward. Typical turn 1, something like land Mana Crypt or land Soul Ring or land into a bunch of 0 CMC artifacts with a Mox Opal. Definitely some kind of ramp. That's what we want in the early game in order to put Urza out. On turn 2, most optimally, we'll put Urza into play, and then the second Urza hits the board, we are at a huge advantage because we just create tons of mana, and that's when we want to be able to slow down the game for our opponents so they don't abuse our artifact count against us with something like a Dockside Extortionist. A lot of time what people struggle with. They want to control everything and everybody, but you have to be really picky about the spells you counter or the permanents you interact with, because at one point you will run out of resources, and whenever you waste a counter spell on one opponent, the other 2 opponents will benefit from that as well. So you have to be really mindful about what things you counter, and that's where a lot of newer players struggle because they don't know if spell A or spell B is worth using that counter spell on or using that removal on. Another really big issue is that this kind of control or stacks really works the best if you are in a pod with more experienced players. What I see a lot is that unexperienced opponents will shoot down stacks pieces randomly because they feel so oppressed by them, without realizing the fact that second they waste a removal spell on a stacks piece that's slowing down the board, it will not only enable themselves to play, but they will also enable their opponents to play. The next thing would be that Urza is oftentimes the boogeyman. You will see people targeting Urza much more than they, from a cEDH player's perspective, should be. You should be attacking that ad nauseam player to lower their life total. You should be aware of that hard stacks like Rule of Law deck or that early combo players. But a lot of times Urza, because he's such a force in the high power and casual community, that kind of makes newer players be much more afraid of Urza than they maybe should be, and that leads us to be the boogeyman, which can also hinder you from pulling out its fullest potential. For Mulligans, first we are always looking for fast mana in order to get Urza out turn 1 to turn 3. Might be a Jeweled Lotus, that might be a Mana Crypt, even a Jeweled Amulet, which will allow you to ramp Urza out on turn 3 if you have enough land drops. Whatever allows you to put Urza out ahead of curve is useful. So first we look for that. Next we are looking for a way to draw cards, because Urza allows us to drop our hand very fast. So we make a lot of mana, we play to the board a lot, so what ends up happening is we don't have cards in hand. So we need something to refuel. That could be a Windfall, could be a Time Twister, and optimally it would be a draw engine like Rhystic Study, Mystic Lemora, or the Reality Chip. But our opponents will win before we are able to, so we need a way to disrupt them. It could be counter magic, stacks piece, or a tutor that can grab any of those. So this hand is really good. We have 3 land, we have a Blast Zone, which is not only a land, but also kind of a stack piece, because if you put 2 counters on it, it will stop your opponents from playing Underworld Breach and other shenanigans. Then we also have the fast mana we're looking for with a Soul Ring, and we have Ponder, which allows us to dig a little bit deeper into our deck or shuffle away bad cards. And then we also have Sensei's Divining Top, which isn't a card advantage engine, but definitely allows us to filter to the best cards that are on top. And we have the March of Swirling Mists, which is an incredibly good card for us because we can get rid of a lot of stacks effects like Collector Oof or whatever might be in play to stop us from comboing off. Very good hand. This is a land I probably wouldn't keep if it's my first 7. Urza Saga just on its own allows us to drop Urza on turn 3 because we can match up Jeweled Lotus and then just cast Urza. But that's really not super efficient because we lose the ability to make construct tokens, and also Jeweled Lotus is basically a ritual, so if Urza gets countered at that point, we're basically out of the game. If, however, I was playing against a Thrasios player, I would definitely think about keeping that because Pithing Needle can take those decks out, but most likely not a really good hand. Urza thrives in a meta that's more balanced, so we want a few turbo decks. We want maybe some stacks also in the pot, because we also benefit from that, right? We need to drop fewer stacks pieces if our opponents do. We can usually play through most of them. Even cards like Collector Oof don't really hurt us that much, because Urza can make mana by tapping the artifacts, which is an activated ability of a creature, not of an artifact. We really struggle with is a very turbo-centric meta. So when everyone was playing Grixis Turbonos or whatever Turbonos variant, we really struggled with that, because at one point you won't be able to back enough early interaction or just have enough early interaction. You might be able to help to stop the first attempt, maybe the second, but the third will get through. On the other hand, if you are faced with a very rule of law stacksy meta, commanders like Winota, if those get out of hand at one point, we won't be able to keep up, because they just have that enormous bot presence with all the creatures that we don't really have access to. We prefer a more balanced meta and more a mid-rangey meta that we can really thrive in. If you see the primer list, you should view that as a sort of recon, as a sort of deck you can use, get started with, but you should analyze your meta. I always say that to everyone who's new to our community. You should analyze your meta and should make specific card choices for your meta. If you now found interest in this deck, you should definitely read the primers. We have very in-depth collaborative primers for both the Polykraken version and the Power Scepter version. A lot of text and also gameplay videos out there on YouTube. I have some on my own channel. I think the most important step to play Urza would be joining the Urza Discord community. It's a very large community. We have a lot of members. It's very active, basically discussing card choices and meta choices every day. Community is very friendly, very open to new players. We will definitely check out your list. We will give you input on your list and explain to you how some combos work, why we make specific card choices and why we don't play other cards. And yeah, definitely join our Discord community.